This is a Canon EOS D60 DSLR camera released in 2002. It was Canon's third ever homegrown DSLR camera produced. I'm not a huge technical spec guy, so what we're going to go through with this camera is actual hands-on use, as well as some practical information about why I like and why I don't like this camera. And we're going to go through whether I think this camera is still worth shooting in the year 2024. Here's a few pictures that I took with the D60 in the last week. Despite its small 6 megapixel size sensor, it still takes good pictures with some limitations. We'll get into that later. The cool thing about vintage DSLR cameras is that they're largely quite affordable now. This camera body is available for around $50 to $75 on eBay in the United States, so it certainly doesn't break the bank if you're wanting to try out something nostalgic. The Canon EOS D60 was one of the first DSLR cameras to incorporate a CMOS sensor, which reduced the production cost quite a bit and led it to be one of the most affordable Canon DSLR cameras ever made to that point. For comparison, the flagship EOS 1D, which was released at the same time as the D60, came in at a whopping $5,500. The D60 shoots in the same 3x2 format as Canon's SLR cameras, and also incorporates Canon's EF mount, and that allowed users to transition from Canon's film SLR camera line and still utilize their Canon EF lenses. Because of its APS-C size sensor, there is an equivalent 1.6x crop factor, basically meaning that a 50mm lens mounted onto the Canon D60 would have an equivalent focal length of 80mm as opposed to the true 50mm shooting experience on a 35mm Canon film camera. This took quite a bit of getting used to for film photographers back in the day. One of the big benefits of the Canon D60 over the earlier EOS D30 is that this camera allows you to shoot JPEG and RAW file formats simultaneously, whereas with the earlier D30 you had to choose before actually shooting the picture. This camera has a tiny little 1.8-inch, 114,000 pixel TFT screen. And it's actually color. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera on, and we'll go to the menu here, which is right there. And you're able to scroll through the settings with this large wheel here. This camera allows ISO adjustment from 100 to 1000, and it's got a clock feature that is enabled by the small little coin battery that's inside right here. And there's also a top menu, as you can see here, and this allows focus and white balance adjustments as well. And you're able to adjust the shutter speed on this camera from 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. If you're familiar with or you've owned early Canon DSLR cameras like this, you might see some similarities between this camera and the Canon EOS 10D and 20D. Those were the two mid-range DSLR cameras released after the D60 in 2003 and 2004. And they carried over the body style of this camera and improved upon the feature set of the D60 as you went into the 10D, 20D, and 30D, which was an intermediate line of Canon's DSLR cameras at the time. Using the D60 is a very tactile experience with lots of knobs and buttons and scroll wheels and on-off toggles. And frankly, I kind of like that compared to the newer touchscreen dominated models. It's a nice blast from the past. Alright, so now that we've got the basics out of the way in this camera, what is this camera like to shoot in 2024? And what are the limitations compared to current mirrorless or DSLR cameras? Well, first off, this camera requires some patience. There is a little bit of delay as you maneuver through the menu, and even more importantly, the buffer and lag time when you're shooting images and displaying them on this tiny little screen is so long it can kind of make you twiddle your thumbs sometimes as you wait. Another problem that reared its head when I was shooting is that this camera only has 3-point autofocus. In shooting so much with my current Canon EOS newest generation mirrorless camera, which incorporates stunning focus and it's able to grab onto faces while they're moving, I had to temper my expectations with this camera and just slow down. And take time to frame the shots appropriately. This camera offers 3 frame per second continuous shooting, which for its time was really quite good, but pales in comparison to today's cameras, which can offer up to 30 to 40 frames per second, which is great for action photography and wildlife shots. In my shooting with the Canon D60 this morning, I actually followed around a canyon towhee bird in the hills outside of southern Arizona. This camera really had a hard time with autofocus and being able to track the bird. So that's where the newer technology of better autofocus within Canon and Nikon and Sony's mirrorless lines and DSLR cameras really makes a big difference. I just had to temper my expectations and really focus on kind of still shooting alone. Another big difference is that the low light performance of this camera, frankly, just isn't great. This camera needs a lot of light to produce a good quality picture. The Canon D60 records to compact flash memory cards, aka CF cards, and I've got one in here, which is what I was using to shoot with this morning. And this 2 GB compact flash card was the equivalent of like a 1 TB card today in terms of size availability. And prices reflected that. A 2 gig CF card in 2003, for example, ranged in price from $350 to $500 for a 2 gig card, depending on the brand and the speed, of course. We've come a long way. Overall, this camera was revolutionary as one of the first intermediate price DSLR cameras and led to iteration upon iteration of technology. And it was the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent of many of the finest Canon DSLR and mirrorless cameras available today. Thank you for watching, and if you want to know how I got this camera in the first place, check out this video over here. It's from a $300 auction win that I did just of DSLR cameras, and this camera was inside of that box. Happy trails and happy shooting. Thank you for watching, as always.